Hello everyone. My name is Daichi, and I will give you a lecture regarding the radiation and remediation activities. So, let's start today's lecture. Today's theme is, what is the ICRP, Volume 3? Are you ready? So far I talked about history for the establishment of the ICRP, as well as its activity, organization, and governance to manage the ICRP.
That is correct. And this time we will move on to the ICRP recommendations, right?
Right. I would like to wrap up today's seminar with explanation focusing on 5 key points regarding the changes in the concept of radiation protection, influenced by the recommendations of the ICRP. First of all, I would like to talk about the expansion of the targeted people for radiation protection. As I touched on in the previous lecture, when the ICRPC, the predecessor of the ICRP, was established, mainly medical workers were subject to radiation protection. After that, addition to the medical field, fields in which radiation was used, were expanded to the agricultural field, and industrial field as well, and people engaged in various kinds of work became subject to radiation protection. Further to that, events and accidents happened, in which radiation protection for the general public needs to be taken into account, including atmospheric nuclear tests conducted in the 1950s and 1960s, the accident of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 1986, and exposure to radioactive isotopes of radon indoors in daily life. And scientific knowledge for the exposure to the public had also been gradually accumulated. For the next, although they have been elaborated in other lectures, I will talk about the deterministic effects and the stochastic effects. Initially, radiation protection for health effects on medical workers, that is, the deterministic effects with threshold values, such as acute radiation syndrome, was subject to consideration. But, as it became apparent that radiation exposure may affect the development of cancer, and the stochastic effects has been subject to consideration, in which radiation protection is taken into account, under the assumption that there are no threshold values. Thirdly, introduction of concept of categories for exposure situations. At the beginning, as I explained earlier, the focus of discussion was on radiation protection for medical workers, as well as researchers, who could be exposed to radiation emitted from sources which are introduced in a planned manner, in other words, exposure under the planned exposure situations. After that, management of radiation exposure to workers in emergency situations was also subject to discussion, such as immediately after an accident of nuclear power plant, that is, radiation protection under the emergency exposure situations. In addition, management of radiation exposure to workers, such as during the recovery period after the accident, as well as management of radiation exposure to the public, including radiation from cosmic rays, and exposure from indoor radon, was subject to discussion, that is, radiation protection under the existing exposure situations. It means that radiation protection according to the exposure situations has become an issue to be discussed. For the next, I would like to talk about the introduction of the concepts of dose limit and optimization. Initially, the ICRP provided advice regarding radiation protection, mainly from technical point of view. However, for the better management and appropriate reduction of dose to people, as explained in another lecture, dose limit was applied to the public and workers under the planned exposure situations. Further to that, the concept of dose constraint was introduced, as a way to further reduce the dose to people, as low as reasonably achievable, even if the dose is already below the dose limit. In addition, even under the emergency exposure situations, as well as the existing exposure situations, based on the concept of optimization, the reference level has been introduced, and by implementing various measures including evacuation and decontamination, mechanisms have been introduced to reduce dose to people, in a step-by-step manner, as low as reasonably achievable. Finally, I would like to talk about radiation protection not only for people, but also for the environment. Initially, the target of radiation protection was only people, but later, the concept of radiation protection for the environment had come up, specifically for flora and fauna. However, at first, the idea was that if people were properly protected from the impact caused by exposure to radiation, flora and fauna would be protected properly at the same time. Later, the idea had come up that flora and fauna should be appropriately protected from radiation, in the same way as people, and radiation protection has been studied in more detail for each species.
Let me see. Except for the last point, that not only people but also flora and fauna need to be subject to radiation protection, every point has been already pointed out by Mr. Daichi in the past lectures. It could means that the ICRP recommendations thus far have had an impact on concept of radiation protection.
You can also look at it that way. In 2028, the ICRP will celebrate the 100th anniversary from the foundation of its predecessor, the ICRPC. It seems that the ICRP is under the process to publish a new major recommendation in around 2028, so its future activities would attract attention from all over the world. So, let me wrap up my lecture by providing you the key points. Today, I explained the changes with time in radiation protection, influenced by the ICRP recommendations. First of all, I talked about expansion of the target for radiation protection. Initially, radiation protection was focused especially on medical workers. According to the expansion of use of radiation, however, workers in other kinds of field has been taken into account. Further to that, as a result of atmospheric nuclear tests, as well as the accumulation of knowledge on exposure from radioactive materials, the general public also became a target for radiation protection. For the next, regarding the kinds of effects caused by exposure to radiation, initially, the deterministic effects, especially on medical workers, such as acute radiation syndrome, were subject to consideration. After that, however, the stochastic effects, including causing the development of cancer, have been subject to consideration as well. For more information on the deterministic effects and the stochastic effects, please visit relevant videos. For the next, I talked about the expansion of the categories of exposure situations. Initially, radiation protection under the planned exposure situations, such as medical exposure, was subject to consideration, but later, the concept of categories of exposure situations was introduced, and radiation protection according to the situations has been subject to consideration. It means that in addition to the radiation protection under the planned exposure situations, the emergency exposure situations, as well as the existing exposure situations have been additionally taken into account. For the next, the introduction of dose limit and concept of optimization was covered. Initially, activities of the ICRP focused on providing technical advice to workers who dealt with radiation, but in order to make radiation protection more effective, the concept of application of dose limit, as well as optimization, were introduced. Lastly, I explained that the target for radiation protection has not been only people, but also the environment, specifically flora and fauna, and detailed studies have been implemented. Okay, today's lecture is now dismissed. See you next time. In this channel, useful information regarding the radiation and remediation will be provided to you. If you like it, please subscribe to this channel, and do not forget to click the like button.